Please clear the way. The speaker is on his way.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. We are about to begin our session, Memories and Reflections, readings by Zia Mohiuddin. Please switch off your mobile phones or put them on silent mode. We would appreciate if complete silence is observed while the session is in progress. Zia Mohiuddin, a legend in his lifetime. His career spans acting, directing, writing, broadcasting, and a wide range of aesthetic disciplines. Zia made many memorable stage appearances in London and New York, both in classical and contemporary works. In 2005, Zia Mohiuddin set up the National Academy of Performing Arts, NAPA, in Karachi. He is also the author of 3 books, A Carrot is a Carrot, Theatrics, and The God of My Idolatry. Zia Mohiuddin.
Ladies and gentlemen, my eyes are behaving improperly, so please forgive the odd fluff. I find it difficult to read with my left eye, and that's the only eye I have left because my right eye doesn't work anymore. So the first shortened chapter that I shall read to you is titled Morgan Sahib. E.M. Forster dedicated his most famous novel, A Passage to India, to his dear friend Ross Masood, scion of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, one of the most eminent 19th century Muslim reformists. The subtitle of the novel is Only Connect. Forster took the title from Walt Whitman. He began to write the novel in 1913, but the First World War intervened, and it did not get published until 1924. Forster's novel depicts the muddled atmosphere that existed in India at the turn of the 20th century with absolute brilliance. His India is a country unapprehendable and vast, where nothing is identifiable, not even the birds. It is a meticulously written account of how the natives, quote, unquote, and the liberal Englishmen understood each other or didn't understand each other. The crux of the novel is not the sustained encounter between the English colonists, whom he describes as well-developed bodies, fairly developed minds, and underdeveloped hearts, and the Indians, but the search for that quite something which makes human beings connect with each other. And it is about personal relationships, about friendship, and the extreme importance of friendship. In 1957, the distinguished writer Santa Rama Rao, egged on by Cheryl Crawford, a playwright and one of the leading lights of the group theater in America, began to dramatize the novel. In a most moving dissertation, she confides, "I decided to try just as a literary exercise. I told myself no one need know that I had had the impudence to take such liberties with one of the century's most celebrated novelists. I needn't, in fact, show it to anyone, certainly not to Forster himself, who must be swamped with any number of far more professional adaptations." But when she finished typing The Curtain Falls, she couldn't resist sending it to Forster, with a letter drafted and redrafted a dozen times. To her utter surprise, within a month, she received a letter from Forster, written in green ink, saying he had read the play, liked it, and suggested that she should come to Cambridge and talk to him about it. The final draft, approved by Forster, was sent to managements on both sides of the Atlantic. The managements hummed and hawed over a play which had a big cast of 25 speaking parts, not to speak of guards, servants, punkhawalas, and 4 sets. They did not consider it financially feasible, especially as the starring role was that of an Indian. After months of deflating experiences, Santa Rama Rao heard from Frank Hauser, the director of a company called the Meadow Players, who requested permission to produce the play at the Oxford Playhouse in Oxford. Now, where do I come into all this? In 1959, I was asked to direct Noel Coward's Hay Fever, a comedy as English as Devonshire cream, at the Guildford Repertory Theatre in England. The mercurial director, Frank Hauser, having heard that an Indian was directing a play as English as Hay Fever, in those days, Pakistanis were usually referred to as Indians, which irritated Pakistanis no end. Hauser was tall and lanky, with a chiseled face on which sat a prominent nose. His eyes shone as he spoke, and after a few pleasantries, he asked me if I had read a novel called A Passage to India. Now, I had read this book in Australia a few years ago and had found it to be profoundly moving. He told me that he was going to produce the dramatized version of the novel in Oxford. "Here, there's a very good part in it," he said. "You mean Dr. Aziz?" I asked. He nodded. "Oh, where would the poor Indian doctor run into the exalted European principal at the Government College?" He intoned in the line in the fake accent that, the goodness gracious me accent, that Peter Sellers had popularized as the Indian accent in the satirical BBC radio program, The Goon Show. "No, that is not how Aziz would speak," I said, and I repeated the line in the manner in which I thought an educated UPite Muslim would speak English. "You've got the part," he said. "Let's go and find some place to eat." Thus began my deep and long life friendship with Frank Hauser. But I digress. After the curtain call at the end of the opening night of A Passage to India, E.M. Forster appeared on the stage to a renewed round of thunderous applause. He stepped forward and talking in front of an audience that included all of the London critics, made a speech. Now, in Frank Hauser's words, and I shall repeat his words, the opening night went off better than any of us could have hoped. It was one of those lucky nights in the theatre when everyone, audience and actors, seemed to come together in a sort of a delightful absorption. Mr. Forster rounded it off by making the best curtain speech I have ever heard. After a most grateful and obviously sincere tribute to Santa Romero, he congratulated the company not only for being so good, but for being so many. From then on, he had the audience in the palm of his hand, and he juggled them into wild applause. A happy evening. When the curtain came down, the great man thanked everyone, every member of the cast, before coming to me. He told me, he held me by the arm and warmed the cockles of my heart by saying that he could not have wished for a better Aziz. Our next venue was to be Cambridge, his hometown, and I asked him if I could have take the liberty of visiting him in Cambridge. I should be very pleased, he said, generously. He was 81 at the time. When I arrived in the theatre in Cambridge for the opening night, the stage doorkeeper handed me an envelope. Inside the envelope was a card written in Forster's scholarly scrawl inviting me to tea in his rooms at King's College the following afternoon. Forster's apartment, bequeathed to him by the college authorities, was on the first floor in the awesome Gothic building of King's College. The old porter who let me in to the quadrangle escorted me up a long flight of stone stairs to his front door. He was shorter than my impression of my first meeting on the Playhouse stage. He was dressed in a tweed jacket and a professorial bow tie. Frank Hauser had described him as a stooping, spry old buffer in a grey tweed suit, glasses glinting the familiar rabbit face. And he was dead right. Forster received me with a smile redolent of sincerity. Mr. Mohiuddin, he said, pronouncing my last name with an Arabic guttural emphasis. And so punctual. Come into my parlor. The living room into which I was led was spacious, surrounded with souvenirs, lovely artifacts, and curios, beautiful pieces of china, and other objets d'art. The walls were lined up with family portraits and landscapes. A comfortable sofa draped with a maroon shawl and 2 armchairs faced a fireplace with a large chimney piece. A writing table was set under one of the tall Gothic windows, and in one corner was a grandfather clock and an upright piano against the wall. Although there were so many objects in the room, yet it did not look cluttered. It was perfectly in keeping with Forster's personality, a comfortable habitat of one of the century's greatest essayists, humanists, and novelists. Punctuality is something I inherited from my father, and I told him so. And then, realizing that I might have been too prickly, added, I can't help it. He nodded understandingly and inquired about my father. I told him that my father had retired as a senior lecturer, but he was universally known as Professor Saab. This amused him greatly. Now, his amusement was not a put-on act. He listened to me with alert eyes as though he wanted to absorb every word that I said. He radiated a sense of calm, and whatever nervousness I had evaporated within minutes. My father, I told him, wanted to go to Cambridge, but having joined the Khilafat movement, had had his entire academic career interrupted. My uncle, my father's younger brother Iqbal, not the other illustrious Iqbal, who had also been to Cambridge, my uncle Iqbal spent 4 years in Cambridge, and having got his doctorate in 3 years, he was asked to do some teaching work for a year. Uncle Iqbal was fortunate enough to have a teacher like the famous Orientalist Professor Brown, whose literary history of Persia in 4 volumes is still considered to be one of the most scholarly works. Forster listened with such interest that I went on to relate a story which had become one of our family laws. Professor Brown's sitting room in Pembroke College was furnished in Iranian fashion, with carpets, cushions, bolsters, and a hookah. His students and friends sat there, often deep into the night, sipping tea or wine, talking about literature, religion, and culture, and reciting Persian poetry. Here, one day, Professor Brown offered a glass of sherry to my uncle. Finding my uncle reluctant to drink, Professor Brown placed his palm on his breast in Muslim fashion and said, "The sin is on me. Drink it." This was the only time that my uncle ever allowed the daughter of the grape to go down his throat. Forster laughed merrily for some time. "The sin is on me. Drink it, I like it," he chuckled. "Would you like me to acquire a sin on your behalf? A glass of sherry?" "No, thank you," I said. "It's much too early." I could see why the story tickled him. In his novel, when Fielding offers to share the enormous expense that Dr. Aziz has incurred on organizing a picnic for his newly acquainted English friends, Aziz declines, saying, "No, no, thank you. The gesture is enough. The act would be too much." I still have a lump in my throat when I recall that scene. As I walked out of the quadrangle, I realized that I had been in the presence of the most civilized man I had ever met. Santa Ramarao has written that Forster's unshakable courtesy elevated good manners to the level of charm, and she couldn't have given a better description. Forster was the quintessence of gentlemanliness. After the run of the play, I went to Jordan to do my first international film. When I returned, I went to see the great man. As always, he wanted to know what I'd been up to, and I told him that I had been playing T.E. Lawrence's guide in a film which was being directed by David Lean, one of the greatest directors at the time. Forster wondered what they were going to do with Lawrence, who had been one of his closest friends. Lawrence died young on a motorbike. In 1932, Forster had written, "A legend will probably flourish, and twisted from his true bearing, even further than Nelson, Lawrence of Arabia may turn into a tattoo master's dream. A tattoo master's asset. The Boy Scout's hero and the Girl Guide's dream. Committees have already been formed directing public enthusiasm about him into suitable channels. They will surely protect him from the sharks, and this is a good thing." "What sort of a man was Lawrence, T.E. Lawrence?" I asked Forster. "Difficult," he said, "very difficult. No one who knew him would venture to sum him up. According to Forster, Seven Pillars of Wisdom was one of the most fascinating and wonderful books of the 20th century. In his profound essay on Lawrence, this is how he had described Lawrence's book. "Round the tent pole of a military chronicle, T.E. has hung an unexampled fabric of portraits, descriptions of philosophers, emotions, adventures, and dreams. He has brought to his task a fastidious scholarship, an impeccable memory, a style nicely woven out of Oxfordism and Doughty, an eye unparalleled, a sexual frankness which would cause most authors to be run in by the police, a profound distrust of himself, a still profounder faith." We have an apt description, we have an Urdu expression which sums up his exquisite prose. "Darya mein kooze ko band kar diya hai." In September 1961, I received a note from the great man asking me to come and see him. I arrived one chilly autumn afternoon at the usual time of 4 p.m. Forster looked a bit frailer. He had a scarf round his neck. A fire had been lit in the big fireplace. I inquired after his health, and he said he felt that his life was going to bits. He asked me if I'd heard anything about Broadway, and I told him that my agent felt pretty confident, but he had not yet received a firm offer. "Well," he said, "I have just had the papers about the New York production, and I have told them that they would be mad if they don't have you." I said I was deeply touched and honored, and that I didn't quite know what to say. "Don't," he said, "you are the part." I felt like getting up and hugging him, but checked my emotion. Forster has written, "When I wrote A Passage to India, I decided I dedicated it to Ross Massoud, out of gratitude as well as out of love, for it would never have been written without him." So was it Massoud who inspired him to write the character of Dr. Aziz? I inquired. He looked longingly at the fireplace where there was a portrait of Ross Massoud, as though he was saying, there never was anyone like him, and there never will be anyone like him. I made him, I made Aziz a bit more down to earth. Masood would never have married a plain woman. But there were others, like Aziz, that I met in India. It was during this meeting that he suggested that I stopped calling him sir and address him as Morgan, as most of his intimate friends addressed him. I said, I was flustered. I can't, I said. I'd feel embarrassed. But if you would allow me, I'd be happy to call you Morgan Saab. Very well, he said. And from then on, for me, he was Morgan Saab. The evening crept in imperceptibly, and for some time we sat in the light that came from the fireplace. I remember the scene so vividly, even after all these years. The bookcases in which French and English authors mingled with each other were lit and unlit according to the whim of the fire. The bookcases were of various height, and in them stood books on modern poetry, ancient history, American literature, books on travel, unarranged by subject or by height. The atmosphere had been described by Forster in a piece he called My Library. Please listen to this. Only at night, when the curtains are drawn and the fire flickers and the lights are turned off, do they come into their own and attain a collective dignity. It is very pleasant to sit with them in the firelight for a couple of minutes, not reading, not even thinking, but aware that with their accumulated wisdom and charm, that wisdom and charm are waiting to be used, and that my library, in its tiny, imperfect way, is a successor to the great libraries of the past. As we parted, Morgan Saab said to me, Aziz is very dear to me. You see, he's the sort of man who would be willing to sacrifice his reputation for the sake of friendship. It was only when I settled down to a successful run of Passage to India in Broadway that I learned about the long drawn-out negotiations that had taken place between Morgan Saab and the impresarios in New York. One letter written by Morgan Saab ended with notes, most important of all. Zia, we all repeat, is imperative, even if poisoned by some aspiring Puerto Rican. Now, the reference to the Puerto Rican was a result of a news item that the Broadway producers were considering the Puerto Rican star Sal Mineo to play the part of Dr. Aziz. When the group theatre sought his permission to extend the run of the play, he wrote back, and I quote, I have only to add that though, of course, I like money, my objective in an American production was already attained. Zia has gained the larger audience he so richly merits and should go forward triumphantly into the future. So I am not bluffing when I tell Miss Strauss that as far as I'm concerned, the play can come off at once. In a letter to Santa, he said, a passage, as you know, was dedicated to and partly inspired by my great Muslim friend, Sayyid Ras Masood, who died in 1937. Old friends of Masood, and indeed of my own, have founded an Urdu hall in Hyderabad, Deccan, to promote Urdu culture. And he went on to ask whether Zia, with his connections with India and the play, might care to make a small donation to it. Santa asked me if I could, and I told him without hesitation that I would. And he wrote back, how very gracious of Zia to consider the possibility of a small donation to that Urdu hall. I hadn't supposed either you or he would, and told my friends about that. I would pass the suggestion on, but I didn't think it was reasonable. You can't be expected to be passionately interested in the enclosed appeal, and nor am I, but it would have had the approval of Masood. I cannot find a better example of his most profound and best-known characteristic, the immense importance he placed on friendship. How can I ever forget what he wrote in 2 Cheers of Democracy? If I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying my friend, I hope I should have the guts to betray my country. The next one is a shorter, much shorter piece called Get On Your Bike, Mate. Judi Dench was not born into a theatrical family. Her father was a doctor, and her mother a sweet-natured creature who may have had strong ambitions about her daughter, but wasn't a pushy woman, not a pushy woman like some American mothers. They were a close family, and they made a point to be present wherever their daughter performed. On one occasion, Judy told me this herself, they were watching their daughter playing Juliet. During the scene when the nurse informs Juliet about Romeo killing Tybalt in a duel, Juliet, overwrought, cries out, "Where is my father and my mother, nurse?" Dutifully, Judy's mother stood up from the stalls. "Here we are, darling, row M, 29 and 30. It is one of the most hilarious stories of recent theatre history. Judi Dench was and still is the pluckiest actress I have ever come across. I have seen actresses and actors, too, for that matter, who are cocky, who are overblown, overconfident, daring, but lacking the gumption to be plucky. Her determination to overcome her physical limitations was astounding. I met her in the balmy days when I was working with the Oxford Playhouse Company. She was a dumpy, tomboyish girl with a wicked grin. You certainly couldn't call her beautiful, but her tenacity and resoluteness to play all kinds of parts stood her apart from all the other ingenues of the time. In the early 60s, Frank Hauser, the brilliant, vivacious artistic director of Oxford Playhouse, had assembled a very strong company, including Barbara Jefford, John Turner, Alan McNaughton, Simon Ward, Nicholas Pennell, Norman Shelley, etc., and Judi Dench. And he added Judi Dench to the list. She had already played the prized role of Juliet at the Old Vic. We struck an immediate rapport because we laughed at the same kind of offbeat jokes. Also, we both had a penchant for understatement. Shakespeare was not the world's worst director. I called her Jude and she called me Z. Our efforts to make each other corpse on the stage earned us baleful looks from the stern Elizabeth Sweeting, the manageress of the Playhouse. Little did I realize that this puckish girl, who seemed to spend all her time in sending people up, was inwardly busy refining her talents. Miss Dench is now a dame. She has scaled just about every peak, including the great unplayable parts such as Lady Macbeth and Cleopatra. And she has earned all the accolades, including the greatest living actress. Yet, in a profession where egos are colossal, her modesty is unquestionable. This is because she has managed to keep her sense of humor. The greatest asset Dame Judy possesses is that she never lets an audience leave the theatre without having experienced something extraordinary. She has an outstanding technique, by which I mean that it is just about impossible to detect her technique. She has harnessed her inner resources so effectively that she can have ready access to her emotions and can evoke her volatility, her resilience, and her sense of mischief at the flick of a finger. Her innate skill allows her to hold a pause until the theatre waits breathlessly for her next line. The magical quality of her acting lies in possessing an instinctive sense of the foibles of the character that she's playing. She's never claimed to be a method actress, and yet her instincts about the contradictions of a character are so sharp and true that almost every performance that she has given is full of brilliance and versatility. Her career has not altogether been an easy ride. When she first played Ophelia at the Old Vic, almost straight out of a drama school, the critics panned her for being naive and inexperienced. But she went on despite having been written off. She is one of those very rare actresses who defied typecasting. Look at her range. Sally Bowles in the musical version of Isherwood's I Am a Camera, and this in spite of the fact that she never had any formal training as a singer. Juliet in the memorable Zeffirelli production. Cleopatra at the age of 52. Only Judi Dench could have been bold enough to say to her director before the rehearsals began, she said, "You must be daft to want a menopausal dwarf to play the part." Judi Dench still has the same boyish haircut that she had 55 years ago. She has now acquired a sophisticated look, largely because she's dressed by the better dressers or the coutures of the day. But that mischievous glint in her eyes tells you that it's all a bit of a lark. Remarkably, in a career that has spanned over 50 years, Judi Dench has never played the lead in a film, had never played the lead in a film until about 10 years ago. And then this happened as an accident. Originally, the part of Queen Victoria was intended for Elizabeth Taylor. But Elizabeth Taylor unfortunately fell ill. Dench stepped in, and when the film was released, she got some of the best reviews of her career. As a follow-up, she was cast as Queen Elizabeth in Shakespeare in Love, which you must have seen. Her total screen time was no more than 8 minutes. But the impression she made was so strong that she won the Oscar. From all accounts, she's now enjoying film renown as M in the Bond saga. Well, she's finished now because she took her leave and was suitably deaded or killed off. But she's still frank enough to declare that with her, the films do not seem to have the same ground as the theatre. When a film is done, she says, it can't be improved. Dead right. I mean, she says, a film is wonderful for chases and for all those things, but somehow, you long for lines, for real lines. Like all the great, truly creative people, Judi Dench flinches at the thought of public's clamour to know every detail of her life. It was better, she has said, in the old days when the public didn't know so much about actors. There was a wonderful mystery about them. We are too accessible now. It has nothing to do with discussing our ideas. What people want is for us to tell a story. Stars, someone said, are couture and celebrities are ready to wear. By this definition, Judi Dench is neither one nor the other. She's a pure gem. But if you were to mention it to her, she will come out with the delightfully bawdy, raucous laugh which comes from the deepest part of her throat and tell you to get on your bike, mate. She has never taken herself seriously, and that is one unique quality for which I admire her so much. This is a piece called, you may have noticed, it was because of my reputation as a bright spark on television that I was approached by an earnest director in the early 70s to play the lead in a film, a musical thriller. As it turned out, it was neither a thriller nor a musical. Or so I'm told. I have no way of knowing because I never saw it. The film was to be made in Lahore, which is now, and this is a sign of the crassness of our times, referred to as Lollywood. It was a very hot summer. The temperature never got below 40 degrees centigrade. I was trying my best to prepare myself for long hours in a non-air-conditioned studio with all the brutes generating their own intense heat. In order to get acclimatized to this ordeal, I used to switch off the air conditioner in my hotel room and with the big windows shut, sit in a chair and try to read. It became unbearable after 20 minutes. 2 days before the filming began, I went to see the director, a short man with a Kashmir white complexion, the body of a welterweight boxer, to ask him about my role and whether he had any special instructions to give me. The director, who I learned later had a vocational addiction to shouting at the crew, was courteous but reticent. His bluish eyes narrowed. Jamil. This was the name of the character I was meant to be portraying. Jamil ke maa baap nahi hai. I said, yes, I did know that he had lost his parents in an accident. He nodded with a smile and said nothing. Is he just a normal young man? Well-brought-up young man? Is he fond of sports? What sort of hobbies does he have? To my surprise, he began to sing a song that had been made famous by Sehgal in the 40s. Katib taqdeer mujhe itna bata de. He stopped singing after singing the first verse. You sing very well, I said. He beamed. I did take a few lessons on the harmonium. There was a long pause, and I wondered uncomfortably if by some chance he expected me to sing in the manner of the late Kundan Lal Sehgal. Jameel, he said, as though revealing a secret. Jameel is hero. Some years later, I mentioned this incident to Peter Ustinov, who, with a twinkle in his eye, said that the well of insensitivity was bottomless. He had worked with some directors who had been equally obtuse. When he was cast to play Nero in the American movie epic Quo Vadis, Ustinov asked his American director, Mervyn Leroy, if he could shed any light on the character of Nero. Nero? Son of a bitch, said Mervyn Leroy. Ustinov waited for further elaboration, but Mervyn Leroy, the director, was firm in his view. Son of a bitch, he said, this time more vehemently. Peter Ustinov spoke precisely, every word finding its place neatly in the subordinate clauses. He had much to say about the educational process of British public schools, especially the bumbling manner in which children were acquainted with the facts of life, quote, unquote. In Rugby, for example, the headmaster, who was considered to be an enlightened soul, once summoned all the boys who had reached the age of puberty to his study. After reassuring himself that the door was firmly closed, he made the following brief announcement. If you touch it, it will fall off. The boys were then invited to fall back into their classes, now equipped to face life. But nothing tops the story Peter Ustinov told me. He once arrived in the theatre one evening to find his fellow actor Cyril Luckham reduced to tears because he had been laughing too much. The cause of Cyril Luckham's mirth was apparent. The first day was apparently the first day of a new term at his son's school. The headmaster, obeying the instructions of a government, the Labour government, by now aware of the dangers of ignorance, was compelled to explain the facts of life to those of a certain age group. Now let Ustinov take over. The poor headmaster had been rehearsing his speech all through the summer recess, and eventually, in a panic of prudery, unable to bear the sniggers he could already hear in his head, he was reduced to composing a pamphlet published at his own expense, which every boy found lying in his desk. The pamphlet began with the following 7 words. You may have noticed between your legs मुझसे कहा गया कि कुछ भी हो जाए थोड़ी सी उर्दू ज़रूर शामिल करें। तो ये आटे में नमक के बराबर मेरे दोस्त मरहूम इब्ने इंशा लिखते हैं, इस मुल्क में हमारी बात कोई नहीं सुनता, किसी समझदार आदमी की बात नहीं सुनता, वरना हम एक ज़माने से लिख रहे हैं कि मर्दों के निसाब में खानादारी का इल्म ज़रूर होना चाहिए। कोई आदमी फ़लसफ़े का एमए हो जाए लेकिन उसे आटा गूंदना ना आता हो तो क्या फ़ायदा। स्कूलों में बच्चों को रोटी पकाना, سالن پکانا, کپڑے دھونا, بچوں کی ناک پھونچنا, پوتڑے باندھنا اور جھاڑو دینا سکھانا چاہیے. اس خیال میں نہیں رہنا چاہیے کہ پڑھ لکھ کر ڈگری لے لی اور نوکر ہو گئے تو لڑکیوں کے والدین ان کے گھروں کا چکر کاٹنا شروع کر دیں گے. اب جو لڑکیاں خود نوکری کرنے لگی ہیں اور حقوق نسواں کا کما حقہ ادراک انہیں ہو گیا ہے, تو جب لڑکی کی ماں لڑکا دیکھنے آیا کرے گی تو لڑکے کے والدین یہ اہتمام کیا کریں گے کہ اسے باورچی خانے میں بھیج دیں. تو کیا دیکھتے ہیں کہ لڑکا حیا کی سرخی چہرے پر لیے شلجم گوشت پکا رہا ہے, آٹا گوندھ کے ایک طرف رکھ چھوڑا ہے. لڑکے کی والدہ بہانے بہانے اپنے ہونے والی یا نہ ہونے والی سمدھن کو بتائے گی کہ یہ ساری چادریں اور تکیے کے خلاف برخوردار محمد رمضان ہی نے کاٹ رکھے ہیں. اپنے کالج میں سلائی کڑھائی میں ہمیشہ اول آتا رہا ہے. کھانا پکانے کی تربیت بھی ہم نے اچھی دلائی ہے. 6 مہینے تک دلکشا ہوٹل میں خانسامہ رہا ہے, بلکہ بیاہ شادیوں میں دیگیں بھی پکانے جاتا رہا ہے. ادھر سمدھن اپنی بیٹی کے گن گائیں گی کہ بہت خلیق اور ہنسمکھ ہیں, ریڈیو پر شوقیہ گاتی ہیں, اپنی صحت کا بہت خیال رکھتی ہیں, اس لیے سہیلیوں کو لے کر اکثر باغوں وغیرہ کی سیر کرتی رہتی ہیں. فلموں کے متعلق اتنی معلومات ہیں کہ سبھی ہیرو ہیروئن کے شجرہ نسب ان سے پوچھ لو, کسی فلم کا خلاصہ دریافت کر لو اور اس پر فاضلانہ تنقید کروا لو. تصویریں بھی بناتی ہیں. آرٹ کونسل کی نمائش میں پہلا انعام ان کو ملا کیونکہ مہمان خصوصی نے حاضرین کی لیاقت کا اندازہ لگانے کے لیے ان سے پوچھا کہ بتاؤ تو فوزیہ بی بی نے کیا بنایا ہے. کسی نے گھوڑا بتایا, کسی نے درخت, کسی نے آٹا پیسنے کی چکی. صحیح کوئی نہ بتا سکا, حالانکہ انہوں نے طوطا بنایا تھا. اب تک ہمارے ہاں دستور یہ رہا ہے کہ کسی نوبیاہتا نوجوان خاتون نے کسی بڑی بوڑھی کو سلام کیا تو وہ جواب دیتی تھی, بیٹی جیتی رہو, اللہ تم کو بیٹا دے, دودھو نہاؤ, پوتو پھلو. لیکن اب زمانہ آگے بڑھ رہا ہے اور اس دستور میں بھی نئی نت ترمیمیں ہونے لگی ہیں. دودھو نہاؤ کی بات تو خیر ٹھیک ہے, کیونکہ آج کل جو دودھ ہمارے شہر میں ملتا ہے وہ پینے سے زیادہ نہانے کے کام آتا ہے. لیکن پوتوں پھلوں کہتے ہوئے احتیاطاً چاروں طرف دیکھنا پڑتا ہے کہ کوئی فیملی پلاننگ والا نہ سن رہا ہو. علاوہ ازیں آج کل بڑی بوڑھیاں بھی اخبار پڑھتی ہیں, ریڈیو سنتی ہیں, سیاسی اور سماجی شعور سے بہرہ مند ہیں. لہٰذا سنا ہے کہ اب اس قسم کی دعائیں مروج ہو رہی ہیں کہ بیٹی اللہ تیرے خاندان کو چھوٹا رکھے, بیٹی اللہ تیری فیملی پلاننگ کرے. سو یہ زمانے کی ہوا کا اثر ہے. اس ضمن میں ہماری ایک عزیز کا بیان ہے کہ ایک عفیفہ نے ان کو یہ دعا دی کہ بیٹی اللہ تجھے خانسامہ دے. خانسامہ کی بات بظاہر عجیب سی معلوم ہوگی, لیکن ان سے پوچھئے جن کے ہاں خانسامہ نہیں. جس تن لاگے سو تن جانے. ایک صاحب کا قصہ ہے کہ دعا مانگ رہے تھے, یا اللہ مجھے موٹر کار دلوا, یا اللہ مجھے موٹر کار دلوا. ایک متدین بزرگ پاس بیٹھے تھے, منغص ہو کر بولے کہ یہ کیا دعا ہے. ان صاحب نے ادب سے پوچھا کہ آپ نماز کے بعد اللہ تعالیٰ سے کیا دعا مانگتے ہیں؟ بزرگ نے کچھ فخر اور کچھ انکسار سے کہا کہ میں تو باری تعالیٰ سے یہ کہتا ہوں کہ مجھے ایمان دے, مجھے ایمان. وہ صاحب بولے آپ اپنی جگہ ٹھیک دعا مانگتے ہیں, انسان کو وہی چیز مانگنی چاہیے جو اس کے پاس نہ ہو. I shall wind it up very soon. You didn't have to show me the timetable. I keep a good track of it. This is a tiny piece called 50 years ago. I was for a brief period a dog's body. a sort of assistant to the stage manager at the Bromley Rep. Technically, I was meant to be an understudy and help with the book, that is to say, be a standby prompter. But I found that I was required to shift the scenery, lay out the props, go around collecting mugs, many of them with broken handles, from all the remote corners, rinse them, run out to get milk, make tea, go out to the bookies next door to lay a wager for the leading lady on the 2:30 at Goodwood, and be ready with an Alka-Seltzer for the leading man. The day never ended. But I didn't mind, largely because the stage manager, Geoffrey Coombs, was an exceedingly likable man who never bossed me and would cheerfully take on almost every chore himself if I wasn't around. We worked on Sundays as well, setting up a new production which opened on Mondays. On Sundays, the golden-hearted Coombs shared his bread with me. He would cut me 2 thick slices from his large white loaf and give them to me with a wedge of Wensleydale. It saved me a bob or two. The word shambolic, very, very popular in the 50s, described Geoffrey Coombs perfectly. He was tall and gangly and was always at odds with his body. His lower half never quite knew how to coordinate with his upper half. He had a problem with his retina, which caused his spectacles to become moist, so that he had to take them off every now and then and wipe them thoroughly. For those few moments that he took his glasses off, his eyes looked like opaque, like boiled eggs. Coombs had given up whatever ambitions he had as an actor and decided to work backstage. If it wasn't for Coombs, I would not have left that place. He thought I was cut out for something better than an assistant stage manager. And so, after 3 months, he persuaded me to leave the Rep and seek my fortune elsewhere. I doubt if I would have had the courage to face the actor's fate, the unbearable certainty of being unemployed for long stretches of time. The years that followed were tough. Acting work came my way sporadically. I survived because I got some directorial work, until a chance came my way and I got to play a lead in a play on the West End. Not so long ago, in the 50 years ago today section of my daily newspaper, The Dawn, the headline was Olivier's tribute to Zia Mohyeddin. Underneath was the following text. Pakistani actor Zia Mohyeddin has the starring role in The Guide, based on the Guide which opens in Cambridge on February 27. Sir Laurence Olivier has pronounced it a special script and said that the choice of Mohyeddin for the title role is the most brilliant casting possible. The news item brought a flood of memories. By 1961, I had become well known in the theatrical circles in England, but I wasn't what you might call a box office draw. Olivier's statement might have excited the imagination of the theatre-going public because the advance booking had suddenly shot up and the 2-week run had been sold out at Oxford. All this should have been very exciting, but it wasn't. Olivier's pronouncement began to pall on me. What if my performance did not measure up to Olivier's forecast? In the Bright Reinhardt adaptation of The Guide, I had to be on the stage in a play which lasted for 3 hours and 42 minutes, The Guide, I had to be on the stage nearly all of the time. It was a dream of a part. The guide, a mercurial character with the gift of the gab, transformed during the course of a play from a scoundrel to a Swami. I had worked enough on the part to know that I had the character in my grasp, but the expectations that had been aroused about my histrionic ability weighed heavily on me. I found it difficult to sleep, and I found it hard, and I found no joy in eating a meal. The nimble-witted Frank Hauser was an exceedingly sharp observer. He took me out to an excellent lunch at the Randolph on the day of the opening night. Normally, he would begin by saying, "Energy, energy, I want more energy from you, pussy, energy, energy." But he didn't. He looked at me for some time and then said, "It's up to you, pussy. You can fret and shrink like a lily, or you can go out and be dazzling. And who's Olivier?" He said. He asked, winking at me with his impish grin. I got up and hugged him. How well he had read what I was going through. His words acted like a balm. From that moment, I shunned all my anxieties. I went on the stage that night, and I did not allow myself to think of the audience or the critics. The first night audience is usually more than generous. This one was no exception. The audience was no exception. I should have felt elated, but I didn't. Back in the dressing room, there were the usual warm hugs from those I knew and those I did not know. Frank came in last of all. "You are not a bad first nighter," he said, with a twinkle in his eye. Knowing his enormous propensity for understatement, his comment meant more to me than all the superlatives showered by other visitors. 55 years ago to this day, ladies and gentlemen, I was launched into a career which has provided me with ecstasies as well as devastating disappointments. A career which I would not swap for all the tea in China.
Thank you, Mr. Zia Mohiuddin. Could I please request everyone to clear the path? Our esteemed speaker will be moving back to the author's lounge. Can you please clear the path?